States and what they're doing with AI, but this is a very global revolution. And AI technology is widely accessible globally. AI experts can go on to websites like GitHub and Hugging Face and download AI tools and trained models, and AI is being used all around the world. How are you seeing AI used in Africa by militaries and in conflict? How is it changing conflict there?
Johan Haru Ipinaja, if I mispronounced it, my apologies. I want to, first of all, thank the organizers for inviting me. A couple of quick observations. If you look around the hall this morning, there's so many of us on our phones or our tablets. Yesterday, I had the privilege of walking around town, and there are people that are on their phones. They just walk onto the streets. And I must say, the drivers in South Korea are very kind. I think in my part of the world, there would be a lot more broken legs. And the point I'm getting at here is that it is clear that probably the single biggest threat is that the humans are getting hooked. But the technology, the machines are learning. And I think this is a very interesting twist on the tale. Now, having said that, before going too far forward, in terms of AI in the battle space, especially in Africa, another major thing that I think we need to appreciate is the issue of digital authoritarianism. And the specter of digital authoritarianism raises its head not just with government, but also with the corporate platforms, especially the international corporates. And this has been alluded to earlier today. But I think also a third component of that is actually the algorithms. And so to this end, our prayer, I would say, is that we do need freedom of speech, but arguably we do need freedom after the speech. And I think this is critical in this era of AI. Now, back in March 2020, in Libya, a warlord that had attacked the capital of Tripoli was in full retreat. And basically, the Turkish-built or developed STM-2 cargo or STM Cargo 2 drones basically attacked his logistics columns. And those drones, some people, depending on your perspective, look at them as loitering munitions. Others look at them as autonomous weapon systems. But the point is that they are AI driven, and they were clearly extremely effective. So this was an attack scenario. In my country, Nigeria, we've had several defense scenarios. We've actually developed some of our own models. The Amebo is one, Gulma is one, Sagumi is another. And we tend to use them in much more of a defense role for counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. We deploy AI so that it can look at basically an environment. When it flies over the environment subsequently, it can quickly tell whether a flood of maybe bandits has passed through the area. And then the third scenario in Africa is from Rwanda. And there we see AI being deployed in peacekeeping. And so we have their activities in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have Rwanda's activities protecting Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. So here we see across Africa, there are many other examples, but attack, defense, and peacekeeping. Now, having said that, one of the big challenges we face is, and again, this was asked by one of the earlier speakers, who really bears responsibility for the mistakes of an AI-driven machine? Because you do have instances where the algorithms might have been developed for one purpose in one environment, and their application is a different purpose in a different environment. And so when we look, and again, forgive me if I use a very broad brush, when we look at AI-powered killing machines, the underlying philosophy, I would argue, and again, I stand to be corrected, is that generally in the West, the philosophy is to err on the side of false positives. That implies that you might let a couple of bad actors through in order to avoid killing innocents. Now, further east, maybe our friends in Russia, possibly some of our friends in China, they may err more on this, or their system, their philosophy tends to go a little more to erring on the side of false negatives. And that is in order to make sure that as few, if not zero, bad actors get through. Maybe a couple of innocents might be sacrificed, but I will stand to be corrected. That said, or that begs the question, what is Africa's position? And this is precisely the conundrum that we face. As a continent, as a people, we do need to basically begin to develop, and this is where maybe international cooperation can help, our own philosophy, our own ethics, our own principles, our own accountability frameworks. Certainly, we need to look at all of these things from our worldview. So even though we need to share ideas with you, it needs to be rooted in our culture, our worldview, and certainly not vendor-driven, which is a major risk. And I'll come back to some of the issues as we go forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mr. Yasuhira, we've been talking about AI in the military space, but law enforcement is also a key aspect of global security. And you've been working for your career at the intersection of law enforcement and emerging technologies. So how are you seeing law enforcement adopt artificial intelligence?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting Interpol to this important conference, and thank you very much for the question. AI is a transformative technology with immense potential to transform various aspects of our lives, and it will surely impact the way people live and work. As we have seen, AI enhances facial recognition for swift identification, optimizes video surveillance and resource allocation, and enhance public safety by providing real-time insights. AI's potential in law enforcement offers a promise of increased efficiency, more effective investigation, and enhanced crime prevention. And we observe that AI is utilized in law enforcement organizations for supporting the analysis of photo, video, and visual information. Facial recognition and tattoo image analysis are some of the examples. Text and speech analysis also assists law enforcement in monitoring social media and matching audio sample from crime scene and phone calls to individuals. We also see AI is utilized for process optimization, which helps law enforcement agencies analyze large data sets and identify anomalies and patterns. Law enforcement applies this capability to traffic management and criminal analysis. We see AI is gradually being introduced to law enforcement activities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Mr. Cronenberg, we talked a little bit about how nations are going to be using AI in military space in a responsible manner. But what about bad actors? What about those terrorists, cyber criminals who they don't care, they violate laws and rules today? How do we deal with those kinds of threats as they're adopting AI?
Well, thanks a lot. I wish I had the answer. But obviously, I think we have to give the good example collectively as nations how we want to approach this. And only if we work together, I think we can also try to avoid this misuse is going to be made by terrorists and other criminal organizations. But therefore, we have to really talk to each other and agree on common guidelines. And also agree, and this was mentioned this morning, on confidence-building measures between the major players in this field. Because only if we act accordingly and if we show that we have a common interest also between all the countries involved, then we will be able to ensure also a sort of, let's say, defense against misuse. I mean, I'm afraid we will never be able to avoid it altogether. But it starts with the things we can agree on collectively and put into practice. And I think one of the elements there is that we, as nations, avoid, as you also mentioned in your book, Paul, a race to the bottom. Because if that's going to happen, I'm afraid it's free for all. And I was struck, actually, to read that the late Henry Kissinger was also very alarmed about developments that were going on in the field of AI. He actually intended to write a book about it, and of course I'm afraid we're not going to have the great advantage of reading what he had in mind. But he also was extremely concerned about this race to the bottom, and his reasoning was that all the countries, in comparison to, let's say, previous periods, all countries are now 100% vulnerable everywhere. So he was very much pleading also for, let's say, strong dialogue between the major superpowers, China and the United States, in order to agree on what actually they should both strive for. And I think if we would achieve that sort of negotiations, it would provide a great input into the confidence building measures, because we would also be able to show that it's not just about nations, it's about terrorism, it's about our infrastructure, be it our banking infrastructure, any other infrastructure, or nuclear installations. We have a collective interest in trying to avoid that the knowledge that is available is going to be put to bad use by other parties.
Wonderful, thank you. General Panwar, if we look at military AI through the lens of your risk-based framework of different levels of risk with different AI applications, are there some military AI applications that are so risky, no one should do them? No military should do them because there's no level of testing and assurance that can get us to a place of confidence in their safety?
Yeah, so that's, thanks for the question. When I talked about this risk-based approach, in fact, after answering your question, I would like to bring out a couple of more points on how it can lead to, facilitate consensus amongst, and I'll give an alternative, a positive twist to this race to the bottom. So as regards unacceptable levels of risk, in fact, the top level in our hierarchy is called an unacceptable risk level, where we put things like fully autonomous nuclear weapon systems. Now, in fact, in the recent summit which was held between President Xi and President Biden, there was some news report that some agreement may be reached on this aspect, although it didn't really come through in that manner. So aspects like it appears to be an ideal candidate, a fully autonomous nuclear weapon system appears to be an ideal candidate to be put in an unacceptable risk level. The second one, which is normally not talked about, but I feel is very urgent, is something called, which we refer to as online learning systems. In principle, anything which is not tested should not be fielded as far as weapon systems are concerned. Now, when we talk of online learning, what we are saying is that while a weapon is in operation, not just deployed, but while it is in operation, it is consuming data and updating itself, that means metamorphosing into something which it was not designed for. And it precludes trust and evaluation because it is online learning. So online learning systems is something which we've also put at the level of unacceptable risk. We can think of some more. Now, coming to the consensus part of it, how does this risk-based framework lead to consensus, can lead to consensus? Now, firstly is the aspect of granularity. Now, we've been having these discussions at the UNGG since 2014, and it's in 2019 came up with a set of principles. But really speaking, more consensus moving from principles to practice is not really happening. Now, when we talk of a risk-based framework like this, well, one can focus on unacceptable risk levels and decide, okay, these are things which it's easy to agree, and nations can agree on that. Similarly, at the lower end of the spectrum, you could have AI-based non-weapon systems like predictive maintenance and logistics, etc. One can easily agree that, okay, these AI-based systems, though military, can easily be developed with least bit of regulation or with some cautions. So going about this risk-based framework brings about a level of granularity. In fact, the type of granularity which has been brought out by the EU AI Act in civilian applications, the same granularity, if it is brought about in military applications, can lead to consensus. So that's one part of it. I would also like to bring in another thought which would lead to consensus. I had mentioned two driving factors which would lead regulation of military systems. So one is, of course, adherence to international humanitarian law, and the second is reliability on the battlefield. So what I want to bring out here is no military commander would like to have an AI system under his command or deploy it over which he does not have full control. Now, if that is a motivation, that actually is in fact, the very motivations which lead to reliable weapon systems are the same motivations which will help in adherence to international humanitarian law. Their motivations are the same, the driving factors are the same. And so, if reliability on the battlefield is taken as a primary factor, that can lead to self-regulation by states. And if I would like to quote the US DoD 3000.09, which is a 2012 and updated recently, as a good example of self-regulation. So if states come up with self-regulatory mechanisms like this directive, that can act as a starting point for discussions where international norms can be arrived at to arrive at global consensus on military systems. And one small last point I would like to state is to do with, again, responsible use of military AI to do with the military. Since being from a military background, I want to bring out this point, that much more than adherence to IHL, the military ethos which exists in responsible militaries is much more of a factor on responsible use of AI on the battlefield than the fear of adherence to IHL. So that's one point I would like to end with. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to follow up on something you said there. You talked about countries reaching consensus on some of these issues, and one of the applications that you mentioned that was too risky, that countries should not do, is fully autonomous nuclear weapons. That seems like a fairly straightforward place where maybe many people would agree we need human control. I think there was a movie about that, and I saw it, and it didn't go very well for people. But we haven't had that many nuclear countries come out and say that they would always ensure human control. So should we see nuclear powers come together, either unilaterally or as part of a multilateral agreement, to talk about how they're going to be using AI and ensuring that humans are always in control of humanity's most dangerous weapons? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the right starting point for people to start, nuclear-powered countries to come and arrive at a consensus on this. And I think if enough effort is, an honest effort is made by the responsible nuclear powers, I think a consensus could be arrived at as far as this aspect is concerned. And in fact, the other aspect, which is, it's too newer field, we are talking about generative AI and foundation models. Now this is where the genie goes out of the bottle, so to say. And I feel that the era of AGI and superintelligence, artificial superintelligence is not too far off. I think the trajectory is there. It might take a few decades, maybe take a little more. This is another area where consensus, and we've been giving our apprehensions in the civilian domain. There also there are implications of that, but in the military domain also, this is another area where I think some discussions need to start, which can be put, how to really put the genie within the bottle and not let it escape.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Traeger, the last two panelists have actually both talked about this concern about a race to the bottom as we see countries competing in AI. And these competitive dynamics are a real concern, not just in the military space, but of course in the private sector as well, among companies. How do we think about global AI governance and managing some of these risks in the midst of this competition where there can be incentives to take shortcuts maybe on safety or on responsible use?
Yeah, I think That's one of the key questions. There seems to be a safety performance trade-off, and we always see this, right? There's an incentive to rush a product to market before it's been fully tested, and in the cyber area, maybe before there are safeguards to protect all of our personal information, and that's one of the main reasons why our personal information can be stolen, or is stolen as much as it is. So this is absolutely a key question. I don't think there's sort of an answer out there that anybody can point to at this point and say, okay, this is what you do to avoid any race towards the bottom. But I do think there's a set of things that are promising to sort of think about. So we can think about where we want the technology to go. We've had non-proliferation regimes in the past. If we're talking about, as the speaker just said, the highest risk forms of the technology, we probably don't want every actor in the world to have access to those forms of the technology. And so that's something that there's a lot of common interest on. Now, if we do something like that, then I think it also impacts the incentives of different actors to sort of undercut each other. If one rival knows, for instance, that its other rival doesn't have access to some dangerous technology, then it has less incentive to go after that technology itself. So I think that's one thing that we can do. We've also heard about codes of conduct. I mean, codes of conduct, I think, are very promising, very important, and it's just a wonderful thing that some of the people on this panel are pursuing them or involved in pursuing them. But I do think also we need to think about some of the specific challenges in this area. When we think about, for instance, often in the security area, if we're going to say that we have a norm against the use of a particular weapon, well, we know usually when a bomb goes off, if it's a bomb. Whereas in the AI area, we don't always know if, in fact, the norm has been violated. So it can be hard. The case of Libya was brought up. We don't really know what AI capabilities were enabled in that case, despite the UN report. And in other cases, similarly. So it's, I think, harder to establish really robust norms in certain areas in this space, but nevertheless, I think we can at least do some good. So that's another place where we can do so good. Third area where I think there's real potential is sort of, as I said before, the area of regulation, particularly of civilian technologies that are so much dual use, and again relating to, well, if we're thinking about regulation or something that is in the direction of regulation at the international level, I think we have to think about how there can be broad communities of voice in the direction of that regulation, the ways that regulation isn't just something that is cutting off some communities from access and voice in the development of essential technologies, but in fact is doing the opposite and giving voice and helping to give real and meaningful access. And if we have an international regime that in fact is doing that, then I think once again it gives actors less incentive to pursue versions of the technology that may be less safe in themselves.
Well, thank you so much. You mentioned briefly proliferation. How do we approach that problem of the proliferation of AI tools to potentially malicious actors? We've seen a number of leading AI labs and experts talk about the potential for these AI tools to be used for biological weapons, for example, a place where there is a strong global norm that responsible states don't do that. But there might be terrorist groups that see it differently, just want to cause devastation. So how can we address that and keep some of these very powerful tools out of their hands?
Yeah, it is really such an essential question. I think I'll answer it just to make it more manageable with respect to frontier AI. And in that case, you know, what we usually think of as being at the frontier are these large models, and so we don't necessarily want to have a proliferation of those models in the hands of actors that can use them for some sort of malicious cyber technology or other malicious use. And I think there's so much that we could be doing there, actually. So, for instance, there are not that many firms in the world that have the cloud capabilities to train these frontier models. So I think there can be approaches to regulation of those firms. There can be sort of know your customer regimes on the part of those firms so that they see what their customers are doing, who their customers are, certainly, but also what their customers are doing. We can do something that we call workload classification. So you might say that there's a malicious actor or some actor that's trying to avoid, let's say, some regulatory regime. Maybe they're trying to create a dual-use technology, or they're avoiding some model evals that a regulatory regime says that they should implement. Well, workload classification on the part of the cloud providers stands a chance, at least, just like in the financial area, of figuring out if an actor in real time is trying to carry out an activity like that. So there is the potential to develop a regime to address these areas of possible misuse. There are technical possibilities, but to make those technical possibilities really work, we need to have also a social solution. So I guess I always come back to there's a lot to be done. I think we shouldn't throw up our hands. I think there are things that we can do, at least to help, if I think also no perfect solutions.
Well, thanks. Well, certainly the technology is moving very fast, faster than the normal pace of policy making and regulation. So we're all going to have to see governments and regulators and ourselves run faster to keep up with this technology. Dr. Shao, I want to talk about how we might see AI integrated into warfare over time and how we maintain human control over that. As we see an accelerating pace of battle, as we see AI increase automation, one of the more intriguing concepts that I've heard in this space is a concept that have come out of some Chinese scholars, the idea of a singularity on the battlefield, that there might be some point in time in the future where the pace of combat action exceeds humans' ability to keep up. And militaries simply have to turn over the keys to machines. Some American scholars have referred to this, I think, very similar concept as hyperwar, certainly very relevant to the title of the discussion today. How should we think about maintaining human control over warfare as we see more AI and autonomy integrated into warfare?
Well, I really worry about rival countries developing worst-case scenario understanding about each other's AI warfare doctrine based on reading of certain comments from the other side. Chinese military experts, for example, they raise very intriguing terms and languages like intelligentization of warfare, intelligence dominance, brain control, using AI technology. Yes, that reflects certain military thinking, but I'm not sure that represent the mainstream Chinese thinking at the operational level. So I worry that for the outside world to base their understanding on limited public Chinese commentary and how that might contribute to mutual worst-case scenario thinking. And in this regard, of course, China doesn't help because China is adopting a lot of secrecy over its thinking, including on AI. That certainly also makes external countries harder to understand China's real planning. And one important technical feature of AI warfare from the Chinese perspective is it's like cyber weapon. It's invisible, and sometimes you require tailored technology against your enemy's systems. You need which means once you use your AI weapon, you basically make it unusable in the future. So there is a lot of emphasis on secrecy. It's a once-off weapon. Again, so all of that doesn't help. So we actually require a lot of combination of functional area expertise with regional expertise in order to develop nuanced understandings about each other's capabilities and policy planning. I think the good thing is China is willing to commit to general principles on regulating military AI. The hard part is how to operationalize it. But I think that's where we can delve into, and what does it mean to keep human in the loop in terms of nuclear command control topic we just mentioned. What does it mean to have meaningful human control over military AI systems? How to do TEVV, testing, validation, verification, validation. In the full life cycle of AI technology development. I think particularly for international research institutes and civil society players, they tend to raise important cutting edge issues, and voices and recommendations from these actors usually receive greater attention from Chinese policymakers than if those voices are from adversarial countries. So I think there is space for deepened discussion with China and help build more substantive and practical regulations on military AI to ensure effective human control.
Thanks very much. And you talked about this competitive dynamic between countries where they're concerned, of course, about what others are doing with AI in their militaries, and this problem of, in many cases, the invisibility of AI. It's not like missile silos that you can see and count, or tanks that you can see and count them. So how do we build trust between countries in that context? How do we build confidence about what other countries are doing that we can assure that they're acting in a responsible manner?
Well, I think it basically requires nuanced understandings. Expert level exchanges. We have had very substantive track 2 level dialogues, including ones co-organized by CNES that involving Chinese and American experts. And you discussed in these dialogues about specific rules of supervision and to ensure effective TEVV procedures can be implemented. How to do reviews and how to trigger re-reviews when machine learning improve and adapt to new battlefield situations. So that's the required process where experts, policy practitioners can use to develop nuanced understandings and mitigate exaggerated threat perception. And another point I want to quickly make is I do think Western countries, like-minded countries who have more democratic control and governance over military AI, unilateral measures from these countries have hugely important impact in influencing and shaping Chinese thinking and Chinese behavior. Right? China is so closely following other countries, especially leading Western countries. So don't underestimate the impact of your unilateral measures and examples. China's adoption of ethical principles on AI, for example, followed American examples and leadership on these issues. And China also closely monitors how US and other Western countries build domestic regulatory structures to govern AI, including military AI. So I think it's very important for like-minded countries to go ahead and publicly promote responsible use of AI policies and principles and explain why this is important for everyone. I think that will help shape Chinese thinking as well.
Well, thank you. That's an important message to hear. Ms. Fahimi, you talked about the importance of technical standards and technical standard-setting bodies in testing evaluation. And I wonder if you could talk more about just the importance of getting this right in terms of testing evaluation and AI assurance, given all of the challenges that we see with AI systems in reliability and robustness and bias, and of course the potential for intentional misuse of some of these systems. And so why is it so important? What's at stake here in terms of this technical standard setting and testing evaluation for these systems?
Thanks for the question. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks so much for the question. I think the importance of standards is really and I think a number of the panelists have mentioned this before, that a lot of the questions and challenges we have aren't for the first time being faced just by thinking about AI and foundation models, et cetera, but we can look at parallel technologies in the past. And so technical standards have served an important function for safety, for trust, but also for trade and interoperability for a very, very long time. So when we think about telecoms, when we think about how what underpins the internet infrastructure, technical standards have kind of set the benchmarks, right, and then facilitated trade as well between countries. And I think that forms a number of important foundations for trust between countries, but trust also with citizens. For example, if I was to buy a product in the past, I can see it maybe from the EU as CE mark, which ensures that I know that this has gone through certain types of testing, it's passed that testing, and therefore I can trust this product. And so I think when we just think about the role that standards play, the assurance, and therefore the certification that products have had in the past before they enter the market, one company entering the market in other jurisdictions, when you apply that to thinking about AI, I think that we take those same principles, that how can we build an ecosystem of trust between countries and also between companies and citizens about what types of testing, what type of evaluation, what steps have been taken to ensure that the tool that they are using has passed certain benchmarks in order for them to be using them. And so I think that that's a critical role that they play. I think, and again, that this is another point that has come up throughout the panel, that however AI potentially poses unique risks, the ways in which we think about testing aren't the same that we have for traditional products. So for example, the speed at which the technology develops means that a traditional certification regime where, you would do the test, you would get a trust mark, and then it would enter the market, quickly becomes outdated in the current space. And so what does that mean for ensuring that we have the speed and the pace for new standards to be developed, for us to rethink what robustness means, what safety means, what accuracy looks like as our understanding of the technology grows, but then again, reissuing those things like trust marks to ensure that, again, we have the shared understanding and the shared language about what all of these areas and, accuracy, et cetera, what does that mean and constitute? The last point I will also make is something we've been working on a lot at Partnership on AI is thinking about the elections that will happen next year. And I'm not sure the specific number, but there are a number of elections, the US, the UK, India, just a few examples that will take place next year. And so when we think about generative AI, I think that the space of security expands to some extent. And so we can't just sort of think about safety and security in sort of a traditional defense space, but we think about the sort of trust in ecosystem and security in a new way. And next year really gives us an important point at which we might see this play out. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is also in relation to synthetic media. So how can we ensure that we build the standards for, for deepfakes, for example, synthetically created audio and visual content? And one example is that one of our partners at Partnership on AI, so we are an organization that brings together over 100 partners around 16 countries, and the BBC in the UK, a sort of trusted media entity, is one of our partners. And when people think about generative AI, you often think about large companies, and people often forget that media companies have an important role to play when we think about trust and think about testing and standards as well. And a lot of them are also sort of developing their own models. And so again, thinking about the elections next year, the BBC has spoken a lot about the opportunities that they see with AI and generative AI and the ways in which they deliver shows and programs and journalism to citizens. But at the same time, they've also been thinking very carefully about provenance, about documentation, about watermarking. And the US executive order, which was just released, also talked about provenance and watermarking. And so when we expand our sort of thinking about security and safety, and then we think about standards, I think that it's going to be we have to sort of think about new methods, new processes, and also think about the outputs of generative AI, including synthetically generated media in this space, which has potentially pretty significant implications in the ways that it can be deployed at pace and at speed through platforms, et cetera, and by news outlets at pace and in pretty critical scenarios such as elections. So all to say, I think standards traditionally so important. There's a very formal ecosystem which is underpinned by WTO rules, et cetera, at the international level for technical standards. But the ways in which they deployed in the past might need to change. The pace at which they've been deployed might need to change. But then also how we think about safety and security and what needs to be standardized and have benchmarks, including in the space of synthetic media, I think is one example that we might see sort of shift, and we're already seeing policymakers respond, including, for example, in the United States.
Thank you. That's a very helpful overview of how we're seeing, particularly in the case of synthetic media, already some early responses ahead of some of these threats. Mr. Ajijo, you left us on an intriguing note in your comments where you talked about values. And I wonder if you could pick up there and share with us how you're thinking about values informing AI adoption.
Thank you. Let me just take a step back for a moment. First of all, Africa, or the African Union, has actually developed a draft AI framework as a precursor to an African AI strategy. This framework, does articulate some general principles and some strategic pillars. However, it's not military-oriented, so that's why I'm bringing it up later. Now, you mentioned values. I stand to be corrected, but because some of the audience may be able to provide us with some updates. But back in 2018, 28 out of 157 countries at the UN then were seeking to prohibit fully autonomous weapons. And under a convention, I think the Convention on Conventional Weapons, it's notable that the United States, Russia, Israel, Australia, indeed our gracious host, South Korea, then seemed not to be willing to support the negotiation of a legally binding instrument to ensure meaningful human control over the critical functions of weapon systems. And so this does speak to what value systems are we applying. And I think many of us would argue that it is imperative that the global community engage in initiatives to curb the development and deployment of fully autonomous weapons. Arguably, you know, the human being still needs to be in the kill decision chain. I mean, one would argue, you know, why do we need to kill at all? But if we must, the human being definitely needs to be there. Another thing that I found very interesting from some of the other speakers was talking about norms or soft laws. And we've seen norms evolve into hard international law in the case of maritime, outer space, I think nuclear. But the challenge with AI is that first and foremost, the gestation period is too long in terms of developing norms and for them to evolve. Frankly, with due respect, existing international laws, I think references have been made here to international humanitarian law, have been seen by many jurisdictions to be violated with impunity, basically allowing the strong to violate these international laws, yet those same laws are arguably imposed on the weak. And so the third challenge I see to norms really is that many of the international institutions that we would use to drive those processes are at best challenged, are at best lethargic. Again, I don't have a better pathway, but I'm just saying we need to acknowledge what these challenges are. But if I may bring it back to Africa, with due respect, I think Africa and its partners, many of you here, we need to build you know, an AI-driven Africa that is prosperous, just, and resilient. And how do we do this? There are three key areas. One, I think, is support for human resource capacity building, the operational people, that middle-level technical group, but also the high-level strategic group, and also researchers and academics. I think these are the key areas that we need to work together you know, to build our human resource. The second major area, I think, is in terms of full participation in global conversations such as this and interactions, because we need to gain ownership of these processes in our own right. And especially in those areas that lead to the development of global good practice. An earlier speaker mentioned the issue of standards. Africa needs to be part of that, again, to have full ownership. And I think also the third major area is we need to cooperation in how we gather, manage, use, store, you know, utilize African data by Africans for Africans, because we believe that such data will be consumed by AI in Africa for the benefit of all. And so I just want to quickly conclude by saying that at the end of the day, the future does not wait, and neither should we wait to secure it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You know, I want to follow up on your comment about the challenges of compliance with existing laws and norms. And of course, this new technology coming in. Given some of those existing challenges, how should we approach then governance for AI, for a new technology? Do we need new laws and norms, or do we just need to focus on strengthening compliance with existing laws like the law of war or existing norms? Do we need new institutions, or need to focus on strengthening existing institutions? How do you think about how we should sort of approach that challenge?
Well, certainly it's going to be a combination thereof, but I think I would argue that it requires some new thinking. And so there would be a need for new norms, possibly that build on some existing norms. In terms of the institutions, I'm very wary about the creation of new institutions because it just goes on ad infinitum. I think one of the things we need to do is to find or to seek ways to try and pivot existing institutions so that they can also take on the issues of AI and some of these other emerging technologies. Because again, what you will find is that some of the older technologies probably will drop off while some new ones come on. And I don't think you can really, it's really practical to create a new institution each time you need, you have a new thread, so to speak. So that would be my response, sir.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Yasukura, how is Interpol approaching AI and adopting AI for its operations?
Well, thank you again for the very good question. Thank you very much. AI-enabled tools are already widely used in Interpol to support our works. And within Interpol, AI is used for search platform for fingerprint and facial images. AI is also introduced to support data analysis and contribute to enhancing Interpol data processing and crime analysis capability. And just for your awareness, within Interpol Innovation Center, which I belong to, we have the Interpol Responsible AI Laboratory. This laboratory was created due to the importance of AI in today's law enforcement context and the growing concern about the use in society. And its creation is also meant to send a clear signal that as a police organization, Interpol embraces the use of AI in law enforcement, but it's equally is committed to advocate for its responsible use in line with policing principle and ethical standards. This laboratory is playing a role of focal point for member country and all matters related to AI in law enforcement. So it is important to emphasize that all these Interpol's AI-enabled tools are only supporting Interpol work. Results are always checked and interpreted by subject matter experts, which is an important part of Interpol Responsible AI. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We only have a few minutes left in the panel, so I want to give each of you an opportunity for last remarks, just really 30 seconds each, on key takeaways that you would like to have participants have about how can we ensure responsible use of AI. Mr. Cronenberg.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, just a couple of remarks. I think the importance is, do we realize what's at stake? What the importance is of the issues we are facing, and have we sort of yet to reach that inflection point, already moved beyond that? But I think one thing is quite clear from the discussion we also had this morning: we need a normative framework, be it additional laws or institutions. But of course we all know if we go that way it will be time consuming and we might not reach an agreement. So I think we have to try to act, and maybe with non-binding, let's say, regulations first before we move into a different legal framework. It's all based on transparency when we talk about confidence building measures. I think that's an important takeaway as well. And we have clearly a common interest to define areas where we know actually what is at stake and what is exactly this race to the bottom when we mention it. Do we know what it implies? And are we capable of sort of stopping some sort of AI chain reaction without knowing what the consequences might be? I think that's the key issue we have to face rather sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you. General Penmar.
Yeah, so essentially I feel that in order to move towards consensus and greater focus in this area, we need to have a language which we use if we are to avoid talking past each other in such discussions. The policymakers need to understand technology better. There has to be a demystification of the AI technology. So for example, we generally talk of unpredictability of AI systems. Well, inherently AI technology, AI, ML, etc. is not unpredictable. Unpredictability is introduced, it's a matter of choice. Similarly, we talk of AI, but we don't really understand which exact technologies we are talking about there. Autonomy is also ill-defined. So I'm not saying we reach definitional level consensus, but at least in the discussions, it should be clear as to what we are meaning about. So more precise language and more understanding of technology and also of warfare. I think these elements will lead to a greater movement towards consensus in responsible military. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Traeger.
So I think we've had some very important processes that have given us principles for dealing with AI. I think those are essential, but I think now we're at the point where we need to go beyond statements of principle. We really need to think about the more concrete things that we want to do. I think we're really at that stage, and I think that is a hard stage. I think there's a reason that we hear principle, because in some ways it's easier for many actors, particularly on the international stage, to agree on principle as opposed to agreeing on real institutions and more concrete approaches and actions. And I think that's the challenge. I think we need to think about working groups that are really drilling down into concrete possibilities now. And I do think that there's a danger that we're not doing that enough. I mean, if you look at the UK AI Summit, it had, I think, a series of important concrete outcomes. But there was a sense in which it also said that we really need some rules of the game for this technology internationally to safeguard humanity, in its words. But it didn't talk about what those rules should be or what international processes should be put in place in order to make those rules a reality. So there's a disconnect there, and I think overcoming that divide between principle and practice is the challenge that we have right now.
Thank you, Dr. Chow.
I think we can certainly simultaneously pursue legally binding and politically binding measures. And I think middle powers like South Korea have a lot of potential and capacity to work together with leading international research institutes and civil society actors to put out concrete rules of the road or code of conduct for national governments to examine. I think there is also room for updating existing international institutions, perhaps some updates to the Biological Weapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention to deal with the AI utility for developing new types of such weapons, arms trade treaty, how to restrict export of AI-empowered small arms and light weapons, etc. I think there is room for regional initiatives as well. The revitalized China, South Korea, Japan trilateral dialogue under the chairmanship of South Korea right now can provide a platform for a regional discussion on these issues, including especially on the Korean Peninsula, where the combination of AI and weapons of mass destruction technology is a particular concern.
Thank you. Ms. Afahimi.
4 very quick points from my end. I think just to echo what one of the other speakers said, principle to practice, I think, is going to be absolutely critical. So the first point would be testing regime is absolutely important. We don't fully understand the capabilities. I think one of the bits of work we've done is trying to develop a good risk landscape. But when you have aspects such as hallucination from models, there's still so much that we need to discover through more testing and evaluation. And so I think putting in place that is really important. The second is, we didn't get to this, but talking about government procurement, the power of government procurement, particularly in the defense and military space. I think there's a question around accountability. If a sort of system makes a, if you call quote unquote wrong decision, who is accountable? Is it the company that the government procured the model from? Is government responsible? And so I think that there's an incentive there, particularly in this space, for procurement to play an important role, also to facilitate testing and evaluations, which government should be driving forward. Third, just think about safety and security widely. I think that the mis and disinformation example, including around elections and in synthetic media, is one to sort of draw all of our attention. I mean, it will implicate all citizens and all jurisdictions, and so that's an important case. And then the last point is this really has to be a global discussion. We really need to ensure that forums are bringing all countries to the table, but doing it in a very meaningful way. It can't just be sort of Western countries. It must be all countries at the table with a voice, and civil society, not just companies. Civil society with unique perspectives also need to be at the table. Thank you to the organizers for having me.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ejijila. Yes.
Responsibility. Each and every one of you in this room has a responsibility in your thinking, in your interactions, and how you work. You are responsible to the underserved, you are responsible to the unserved, and you are responsible to the unborn. They are not here at the table to participate in these conversations and discussions. Yet, in the future, they are going to have to live with the consequences and the precedents you set. Kamshamida.
Well, thank you. Mr. Yasuhira.
Oh, thank you very much for this discussion. Many panelists talked about framework and principles, so please allow me to make another advertisement of Interpol achievement. Interpol Responsible AI Lab first major milestone was a publication of guidelines on the responsible use of AI in law enforcement. We call it Toolkit for Responsible AI Innovation in Law Enforcement. It was developed together with United Nations, so this material is available for the public on the internet. So if you are interested in, please access Interpol website. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all of the panelists for a very rich and engaging discussion today. Please join me in a round of applause for the panelists today.
Thank you. Thank you to our moderator for leading the session, and thank you to